Welcome to the Creative Community Podcast presented by Destination Arete. I'm David.
And I'm Mark. We're building a community of creatives who work together to achieve creative excellence. Today's guest is storyboard artist and art instructor, Lincoln Adams.
Lincoln shares the difference, or rather the similarity, between creating a story concept like a storyboard versus a still image like an illustration.
Lincoln also shares the biggest risk that he took in his career and how it ended up being the best decision he made for his career in the long run. So, without further ado, here is our conversation with story artist, Lincoln Adams.
Hello, my name is Lincoln Adams, and I am a story artist in the animation industry. And when I'm not working on a show or a film, I teach at the Cleveland Institute of Art. So I sort of have these sort of parallel careers going. And sometimes that can be tricky when you're working, because when you're working on a show, they're usually thinking you're putting in 40 hours, which I am. And when you're teaching 3 days a week, it's a lot of hours. So it can get a little hairy. But this is kind of the weird downtime in the industry. So if you're in the middle of a show, you might be finishing up on something, but usually stuff kind of takes this weird hibernation in December and early February, and then things start to ratchet up. So what I was working on in December was doing some work for Illumination. And Illumination is a studio that worked on such great films as Despicable Me. That's probably one of my favorites. I actually like Sing a lot. I don't know if there's other films I don't like quite as much by Illumination, but I had a chance to work on Despicable Me 2 for a little bit, and I worked on a few things for Sing 2, which is coming up. And then I was working on a kind of on other projects. They were in the middle of pitching it. So in the world of story, if you're in a film or even a TV show, if you're trying to get your idea greenlit by the powers that be within the studio, you kind of have to develop a pitch. And I was working on boards. So there's a concept floating around Illumination that is director driven. And I was working with one of the directors, and they just wanted to pitch something to see if it'll work. So we'll see if that comes down the pipe. But that's what I was most immediately working on in the world of story. And a story artist, for everyone, if you're wondering, well, what's a story artist? What does that mean? I've heard of storyboards, I've heard of picture books and stories, but what is a story artist? A story artist is someone who takes a script or an outline of a script, and our job is to visualize exactly what it's going to look like on screen. You're like, what does that mean? It means I have to be part cinematographer, part animator, part actor, part editor, de facto director at times, so that when I create a sequence and it's edited together and it's me coming up with the cuts and the timing on it in drawn form. Oh yeah, you got to draw like Glenn Keane too. Which nobody can, but you gotta aim for the stars on
Right,
that,
right. Over the moon, right?
Right, the Andy Harknesses of the world, Jamie Lopez, who I've done work for. That guy can draw like it opens his hand and it's like the perfect stroke. You're like, forget it, quit. But your job is to make it look like, with all the characters and all their acting choices and all the shot choices, this is what the film is going to feel like. And so for me, it's a thrill to be at the front end of a production, which is where we are. We're the blueprint. If it doesn't work in the boards, it's not going to work at all. There's no special effects. There's not enough acting in the world that can fix a story that doesn't work. And if it doesn't visually work, pace-wise, edit-wise, choice-wise, acting-wise, you can see that in the boards quicker and more expediently than if you send it all the way through the pipeline to animation, or to previs, to animation, to lighting and texturing, post. Nobody wants to go that far down the line to find out their movie's no good.
Right.
So that's my role in animated production and the pipeline, and I love it a lot.
Well, that's so cool. I almost want to ask follow-ups just to that. I mean, we have our
Yeah.
own questions that we want to get into, but man, well,
Go ahead, Mark. Ask him one.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll just transition into our questions because I think it's a perfect segue either way, and I'll get to ask my question. So, so when you go to your website, you see that not only do you do these sequential art pieces where you're doing, you know, different things for animated film, but you're also like a very excellent like still image illustrator. You've illustrated book covers, you've illustrated a myriad of things, advertisements, and you're excellent at both. But we were curious, what maybe are the similarities and the differences that you think about in your mind when you make sequential art, which is like something like a storyboard, versus just an image that's going to stand on its own?
Story. That's the short one-word answer, right? Okay. But let me unpack that. Okay. So story is the linchpin. You could say narrative. If I'm working on an ad, and what you didn't see on my webpage, because I don't do it anymore, but I did it for like 10 years, is graphic design. Okay. You're trying to convey a thought, an idea, or an emotion, and you're trying to communicate. And that's a story. In advertising, it's the story of the product or the service, and the story of the consumer or the audience who's going to purchase that product or service. You have to communicate a story and an idea, and people have to react to that. Okay, so there's how that works in advertising. If I'm just dealing with a single image, whether it's a portrait painting or a book cover, I'm still trying to deal with how do I communicate a narrative, feeling, or an emotion. And it's about timing too. And a lot of people go, well, I can see the pace in a sequence of images. What do you mean by pace in a singular image? What I mean is there's a place I'm going to look at first in the image, but I'm going to have compositional elements, road marks, or landmarks within that composition where my eye is going to move. And even though I might have a focal point that I go to first, that might not be the story point. There might be a little subtle thing in the background that really is the crux of the whole story. So there's the timing in where I get to it and how I get to it. So the same thoughts that are crafted into one image get translated to a storyboard, which you have many images to unpack, but you're still composing. I could even look at typography and I could go, what's the story of the feeling of that serif? Why are there so many fonts? Because they all feel different. They all convey a different idea. So that's really the linchpin for it all. It's story. And when I'm teaching, I say that. I got students that, when I work on their senior thesis films, they're shocked when they come in and go, well, I'm going to do some advertising, branding stuff. And they're like, hoo-hoo, you can't do this. I'm like, I got the t-shirt on that. And by the way, your brand does not convey anything. It's just a product. That's not a brand, dear. It's just a product.
He said dear.
I love you little Padawans, but that is not a brand. That's just, pop. Right? Yeah. And they're like, what? And so when I start breaking down the narrative behind how branding works, they're like, leave me alone.
Yeah. Man.
Somewhere they're all turning red and shaking their fists.
Yeah. Well, I hope that they're listening. You talked about the difference between the story point and the focal point. That is such an interesting idea. I've never heard it expressed that way. When did you discover that? When did that click for you, the difference between the story point and the focal point?
I think when I started really kind of teaching in the continuing education department at my school when I was just starting to teach. This is probably, might be, I don't know, 13, 14 years ago now. And I started picking apart and looking at stuff. And there's the classic way we look at design. We could use the rule of thirds. We can use the golden, whatever it's called. I couldn't even tell you what it's called. But most students can go through it. It's this, it's that. It's like, okay, whatever. All it does is help us figure out where's a good place to put a focal point, right? And how to keep your image counterweighted. people always go balance. I go, it's not balanced because it's not equal. It's not an equal distribution of things. It's counterweighted. You know, if you have something that's larger, you have a few things that are smaller and not the same size, you're counterweighting where your eye moves because it forces your eye to look around. But that doesn't mean that's the story. It just means that's where your eye goes first. Story point is, why am I making this image? What do I want my audience to get out of this? If I just want them to look at the focal point, then I don't need to worry about composing the image, right? But if there's something that's more important about why I'm even looking at it, what's the whole story, right? I can unpack all kinds of information by looking at Norman Rockwell. I could unpack so much about looking at Gary Larson, who is the cartoonist and writer for The Far Side. That's where it started to hit me. Ironically enough, reading Gary Larson's breakdown of his own cartoons.
Wow.
And he's like going, the reason that this one works versus this one is because of the timing. You know, in one, and I wish I could pull this up. I don't have it handy right this second. But you got these chefs on one side of the frame, kind of looking into the shot. And he was lobster sitting on this carnival contraption, right? Like a dunk machine, right? And they show the chef got his arm out and the ball's in midair in the frame. And he's like, the gag was there, but it wasn't funny. So the focal point took me to the lobster, but the overall story point was lost. It wasn't funny. And he's like, well, why isn't this funny? You know? And what he did was did a second version, the one he eventually sent to the printer or to the publisher. He recomposed it ever so slightly, but more importantly, he had the chefs, like 3 or 4 of them, standing there and just flipping the ball in the air, and he placed several on the ground and had the lobster sitting there. And that's when it became funny. It became funny because we got to anticipate. He did not tell us everything in the shot, and that's something that most people sort of miss when they're developing an idea. It's about anticipation or setup and an aftermath or payoff. And when I started looking at the great illustrators that I loved, N.C. Wyeth, Norman Rockwell, great cartoonists like Jack E. Davis or Mort Drucker or Gary Larson, and they're just dealing with single panel. They knew how to tell you things and let you draw conclusions. Amazing. And that illuminates the story point. The focal point is just a visual reference point in the image. The story point is the reason we do any of this.
Yeah. I love it. I could just listen to that all day. You said that you came upon that idea when you started teaching or around that time, right? Maybe not necessarily because you were teaching, or maybe because, I don't know.
It might have been, I think it was because I was teaching, because I was trying to figure out how was I going to teach people things that were important. And a lot of times, until you sort of organize your own thoughts, your own strategy, you're just going on guts and guile. Whatever formal education you had, it was 10 years, a little more, it's about halfway in my career, about 10 years removed from school. So I had some, experience under me, but it was just, I wasn't always thinking about the why I did what I did. I stopped thinking about the whys, codifying the whys when I was in school. Making a living, you're just like getting better and improving, but you're not questioning every little thing you do. So when you sit down to kind of formally organize it, you start discovering some things. And you're like, oh, hey, wait a minute. Hey, it's a good thing this is video, because if it were audio, it'd be like, what's this guy doing? Sounds like a caveman zombie.
Oh, that's great. Well, so what role we talked a little bit before we started the episode, but about your art teacher and about friends from school. So what role did people like that, or we could call it your art community if we want to, or just the people around you as an artist, what role did they play in you choosing to be a story artist and to be a teacher? Was there a point where your art community kind of informed your decision making, or was that something you came to on your own?
I would say it's something I came to on my own. Now, at different points, and this is one of the harder parts about, in my career, I've been largely a freelancer, although there have been periods of time where I have worked at a company. But when I would work for companies, usually we were an art department that was part of a bigger company, and the product was not art. So when you're in an environment like that, you are just the hand that makes stuff look pretty. You are the first budget that gets cut, and you're the last budget that gets a raise. Because the product, because you're just there to make certain things about the company look good. You're not the product. You're a service.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing wrong about that. It just is what it is. So you don't always have a great community. When I first met Jesse, we were working at a company, and that was kind of like that. But I have to say, in that case, Jesse was such a great person to work with that, that became the community. And I think that was actually, ironically, that was the first time I started putting information together, because I was creating a packet for how to draw that I could leave for somebody else that might take my job. And I think I completed that right before he left, and I gave it to him. So that might be part of that art community. For those of you that don't know who Jesse is kind of a mutual friend that we all know. So mysteriously, his name just pops up. But that was important. I think in terms of my career, what really moved me to be a story artist was economics and desperation, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. And
You're welcome to be honest. Yeah.
So if I could say economics, desperation, and eureka. Okay. Economics, as an editorial illustrator, which is where I started my life. Editorial being work that you do for magazines. So if you're looking at the cover of Time magazine and you see a painting, of some situation or some person, we would call that an editorial illustration. If you open up the magazine and there's an article and you see this image that has some relationship to this article, that's an editorial. It's not an editorial cartoon. It's not a cartoon. It's not meant to be funny necessarily. It's a full-on painting image. That's what I wanted to do. I fell in love with great editorial illustrators. C.F. Payne, Gary Kelly, Sterling Hunley, Anita Kuntz, Brett Holland. These were my influences in school. Had nothing to do with animation at all. But the budgets changed, print changed. You couldn't make a decent living. And that was frustrating. So my first evolution was to teach myself graphic design. I had a typography class when I was in school, and I kind of parlayed compositional design into page layout and then solving problems. We were taught to solve problems, ask why, solve problems. So I can talk about this because that was part of my education, So it was easy to transition. So if I can find the through line, I can make the transition. So economics drove me to be a designer. Well, being a person who loves to draw and paint, not being able to do that and just deal with type got boring. And I got desperate. And, of course, by this time I'm married, I've got, a stepdaughter and an infant. And I made foolishly, or maybe not so foolishly, at the time it didn't seem foolish, and then going through it seemed foolish, and then on the other side of it was probably the best thing I did. We suffered for it, but it was probably the best thing. Was I left the job as a designer. It was a good paying job, and I would started building up a freelance clientele, and I was going to freelance from home and paint. Well, that was 2009. January 2009, and the bubble burst a month after that in February, and it downhill. So, I'm struggling to figure out what I'm going to do. I know I can't make a lot of money being a full-time editorial illustrator. It's just not going to be a thing. There isn't any full-time editorial illustrators today, as great as they were. C.F. Payne is retired and is a chair at a school, art school, right? And he was doing that. He used to live in Dayton, Ohio, and he chaired CCAD 2 hours from us for years. This guy's on the Mount Rushmore of editorial illustrators, okay? If he's not getting the gig, I ain't getting the gig.
Right.
That's how that goes. It's just a reality. That guy's got silver keys and gold keys out the yin yang. For those who don't know what a gold key or silver key is, that's like getting like the Oscar or the Emmy, and he's got a bazillion of them.
Wow.
From the Illustrator Society. He's just like reaches in his pocket to pull out change, and a gold key falls out. Oh, where'd that come from? Oh, my bad. If he's not getting work, I'm not getting work. So I mean, that's just what you learn. And nobody would hire anybody for design either. But no advertising agencies, nobody was hiring anybody to do anything. And there's this film called The Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith. I watched it one time. I can't watch it again. It's too traumatic. Because that's what we were living. Wow. I felt like I was toting around my portfolio of my career like he was this computer, going from place to place with his son in tow, half homeless, just going, I know this is going to work. If someone just gives me a chance, I know this is going to work. I watched that. That was probably the lowest point in my career, because I got to support a family. We're struggling. I got part-time grunt work at American Greetings, not doing artwork, just doing color correction, right? $15 an hour. Man, it was difficult. It's difficult for my wife. It's difficult for my kids, just the reality of knowing, hey, if I get paid, I can con the person that's coming to shut our water off to go around the block because we just got paid, we could deposit it and you can take it. I wish I could say that was hyperbole, but that's real. So where's the light at the end of the tunnel? I'm glad you asked. I visited my sister and my brother-in-law, and we were watching The Incredibles on DVD. We got to the end of it, and I love the films, love animation. I love watching films, more so now than I did then. And I'm watching the behind the scenes, and they're showing the animatic process of the film, and they're showing story artists drawing how the film goes, and they're acting it out, and they're pitching it, and it was like the light bulb just went, whoa. Because when I started out doing what I did, in fact, if you even go back to my thesis here, I was an illustrator and I made a limited animation. I didn't even know what I was doing. My goal was to make this I was like, I'm just going to do Reading Rainbow, which is, for those of you who don't know what Reading Rainbow is, it was kind of a PBS show hosted by LeVar Burton. And they would just kind of move the camera along a book, and they would sort of make it look like a little film and cut it together, maybe some cross dissolves. And I went, you know what? I could do better than that. We didn't have computers. I had to con the video teacher into letting me use a beta cam, and an Avid to edit this thing. But I did some little film study over the summer before my thesis, read up on it, and I thought, I got a story. I can do this. And I created these monoprints and put the music to it, and I made it. I never thought I'd be able to do it again because I was going to be an editorial illustrator and I was never going to have the equipment, So that just went on the shelf. But when I would do editorial illustration, I would act it out. I would sell half my concepts to the art director. The sketch would be like, that's cool, but that's funny what you just did. I think they were sold on the performance more than the composition, And that's why the light went off, because I went, holy crap, I do that. I did that. There's a place where you could do this. There's an entire career. You have to understand, going to school in the 90s, late 90s, mid-late 90s, there weren't any animation programs. There's no animation programs. Ringling, Cal Arts, UCL, UC Berkeley, maybe Sheridan in Canada. It wasn't a thing. you know. Now you got the Savannahs, you know, the big illustration schools like Savannah. Now they're big animation schools, you know. But then, everything that went on in animation was like this little bitty secret. Who knew that most of the work that you could do as an animator outside of editorial and advertising was in the film industry? Because nobody told you that there were matte painters. You have to, you would find out when you get your little Star Wars, you know, coffee table book. You're like, look at all these paintings, that's so cool. Who does that? Right? Nobody tells you that they make color keys and color designs in the art department so that they figure out how they're gonna paint the backgrounds in you know, Prince of Egypt. Nobody tells you that. Nobody tells you, this just wasn't there. Illustration programs didn't talk about any of that. So I felt like I had wandered through the wilderness to arrive at a point that made sense. And at that point, it was like, I was voracious. I'm gonna find out how to do this. I gotta talk to people. I can do this. I can do this. I got, you know, 10, 12 years of drawing stuff. I had to teach myself how to draw like an animator, but I didn't have to teach myself to draw. I didn't have to teach myself to compose. I had to teach myself to think like a cinematographer, but nobody had to teach me how to compose an image. All that's there. All that's there. I knew I could go get it. I knew I could go get it, and I did. And that's what I've been doing ever since. Each year, my clientele would build up. Each year, I get bigger and better shows. It's not been easy all the time, but, you know, it has steadily gone like this, you know, to the point where I can list DreamWorks TV, Disney TV, Illumination, Oddbot, you know, clients like Netflix. You know, I can, I've been blessed.
You have an IMDb.
I do.
That's really cool. Like, would you have thought like I would be on a website that, you know, like when you first started that, when you first watched that Incredibles behind the scenes, I'm assuming that you would not have thought like, this is what my list will look like in a couple of years.
I didn't know what my list would look like, but I knew I was going to do it. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't going to stop. You know, I've been fortunate along the way that because I was hungry, and I think because my family was hungry, and that's something you can't tell students. You know, I often wonder, you know, you're teaching some students, and some students are like, yeah, and they're just going for it. They're voracious, they're hungry, they're going to get it. And you get other students who are just not hungry. Talented, not hungry. And you can't teach hunger. And you can't teach will. And you certainly can't teach faith.
Yeah.
You know, when your will is not there, the only thing that keeps you going is faith, because you're going to always be hungry. You're never, as a creator, never going to be satisfied. There's always going to be pressure. Either it's pressure to pay the bills, or it's pressure to make yourself feel like you're fulfilling yourself creatively, you know, or pressure to, you know, give what you need to give to your family without that blowing up in your face, which it often has. Sadly, you know, so I spent a lot of time trying to fix that, you know, because you can be too driven, you know. But yeah, it takes hunger. You got to be hungry. You got to want it. And when people in the animation industry see that you're hungry and not a jerk, they're willing to give. Oh, so many people have contributed. And this might go to the art community. I developed more of a community after I got into this industry than before. And I think that's been really helpful, you know, especially through something like LinkedIn, where at first it just seems like, oh, you just connected with people. And it can, if you use it the wrong way, or you're in the wrong industry, it's just a glorified Facebook without all the, you know, photos of your dinner and political arguments. But in animation, when you connect with people and you got legit ability and you go, hey, I want to get to the next level. They're like, wow, holy crap, you're doing this? You know, well, but what I see you could do is, and then you go, hey, I did that. And they're like, wow, hey, you really did take my advice. Hey, wow, great. That's the back door in. That's what I learned. And so that community has been very giving. Things like going out to Ctn Expo every year, although we couldn't do it this year because of COVID. We did do an online version. that helped me connect with the community. The Ctn Expo, for those of you who don't know, it's a network, a creative talent network, that this convention brings in animators and everybody in the pipeline, 3D modelers, lighting and texturing, story artists, 2D animators, 3D animators, comic book artists, and it's all shop talk. It's networking and shop talk, portfolio reviews, getting a gig. So many times I would wander around and you'd say, hey, such and such studio is looking for board artists. You might want to go over there and show you stuff, right? It was like that. One of the biggest influences that I had early on, and I won't say who the name of the person is because there's some things that are developing right now that, I'll put it this way. I met a person at a very, very big animation studio, a big one, a feature animation studio that's very, very big. You got one of two options.
Yeah, I was gonna say. There's
and many times they're under the same roof. That's all I'm gonna say. Yeah. And that person who I showed my portfolio to said, wow, you've got some drawing chops. And I see that so you got some really good things going on here. But, there's some things you can do to improve. I said, tell me. And he said, you really want to know? Like, yeah, you're not going to hurt me. I've been doing this for a minute. I've been an artist for a while professionally. I've had art directors say, no, that sucks. Do something else. You're not going to hurt me. I'm here. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to come back out here again. So I'm here to get everything you can give me that you're generous enough to. I'll absorb it all. This person gave me a bunch of notes. And I went home and I redid the board with all of their notes in less than a month. And I said, hey, I redid them. Can I send it back to you? They're like, yeah, absolutely. Send it back. They're like, wow, this is such an improvement. You know what else you could do? We did 3 rounds of that. 3 rounds of that. Mind you, this is a person who does not owe me anything, donating their time and their expertise. That was 11 years ago. Now, this is how long it took me to kind of develop into the board artist. But this is what that connection then means now. That person is either a story supervisor on one of the last 3 or 4 films from said studio and a co-director on one of the last 2 or 3 films from said studio. And they have said, hey, I put your name in. I didn't even know they were looking for a board artist. I got the email came out of the blue. I put your name in.
That's awesome.
Even if I don't get the gig, because it's so competitive. And here I am in Ohio. I'm competing with people that are living out in LA. They know everybody. They've done this, To even have someone say, I put your name in. That speaks volumes to them, and it speaks a lot to just the journey. It's a longer journey than people think. And I think that if for young people who are beginning in their career, who might be listening to this, the immediacy of this, it's not immediate. I've been a professional for 22 years. There's nothing immediate about this. Even when I started out, I thought it was immediate because I got a bunch of illustration gigs. I got a bunch of freelance work because nobody would go to the magazines in Cleveland. I was a kid. I went out and I said, hey, look at my portfolio. I went out there and got it. Hey, if you're not going to go, I'll go. I got work at GM because my best friend, I got a call from a guy that worked there that we used to be an RA with. And he goes, hey, why don't you bring your stuff up? I'm like, dude, I don't draw cars. He's like, I don't need you to draw cars. I need you because you have good ideas. And he says, and tell your friend to come up. Tell him to get his portfolio together. He didn't want to do it. He never did it. I was the only one that went up. I was 23 years old and they were paying me at that time $25 an hour to draw all day long. And they paid for my food and my room and board because I said, yes, I'll do it. So that attitude is what's maybe be able to survive, but it's also, it's what keeps the journey going when it could derail. So it's a slow burn. and it goes like this, and it goes like this, and sideways and up and down. So
Wow. That I don't know what. Well, Mark, I mean, I know what I want to say, but I've said a lot, so I want to give you a chance to kind of.
No, seriously, go for it. Go for it.
Well, I think going back and forth three or four times with that person on those boards, a couple things on that stood out to me. First of all, I think that speaks to the fact that you do have that hunger to get better.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of people don't have that or aren't willing to admit that they are not where they want to be. Even when they hear it, they're just kind of like, well, why would I put the work in? I've kind of worked already. I don't want to do that again. But secondly, I think it just speaks to, I want to ask you this maybe. Did that person, they got the chance to see that you were hungry because you were willing to correct the things that they, you know what I'm saying? Like it was your humility to say, I'm hungry enough to try this and try this and try this. And I think they were more recipient of you sending them a new board because you were willing to put that work in. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure it was, because I know when I'm teaching, I've had students who are like freshmen who aren't in the department yet, who would come in and they go, "Can I sit in your class?" I'm like, "Heck yes, you can come sit in my class." If you're coming in on an off day when you could be and probably should be doing homework for another class, and you want to figure out and they're like, "Can I do some of the assignments?" Yes, if you want to take the time. They're like, "I know I shouldn't ask you, but what do you think of this?" Yeah, if you're taking the time, I'm going to take the time to help you. You're going the extra mile. Why would I say no?
Right.
You know, I had another friend I went to school with. You know, this again, art community is it finds its way back in. He was my roommate, great friend of mine today. He was my roommate my first year. Everybody made fun of him because he would go and sit in the car class at the Cleveland Institute of Art. Contextually, Cleveland Institute of Art for industrial design and car design in particular is like going to CalArts or Ringling for animation or illustration, for those that don't know that. And so he would go to the Saturday car class every week as a freshman. And we didn't go and get into our major until after our second year at that time, because it was a 5-year school. So for 2 years, he went every single Saturday. Every single Saturday, he did all the assignments on top of the rest of his classwork. Everybody's like, "You shouldn't be drawing cars all the time. You should do your work." Guess who got an internship after his first year in the department? Guess who got three offers? I'm finding that because more and more young people are dealing with either emotional trauma or mental health issues, they're struggling to access will. And that's even people of faith. You know, so if you're not a person who has a faith in Christ and you're dealing with these things, it's really hard to access your willpower, and it's hard to stay inspired to even do it. So I've learned that the longer I'm teaching, the more I discover that, you know, I've never seen a lazy student. I've seen a lot of students who can't, which is heartbreaking.
Wow. Well, other than the credit titles on our favorite streaming platform, where can people find you?
Lincoln Adams illustration.weebly.com.
Great.
And that's where I post my work. And generally when I have a new animatic, you know, which is tough when you're working on a show, you're usually about a year behind when you can show something because of air dates. But occasionally when I'm not working on client stuff, I can work on new stuff.
Man, we are so grateful to Lincoln for sharing his time, insight, and wisdom with us. You can find him and his work at lincolnadamsillustration.weebly.com. And he has up on there, he'll throw up some storyboards that he's been working on, or different animatics that he's finished for either feature films or TV shows that he's been working on. So it's a great place to follow his work and just see really just the awesome stuff that he's getting the opportunity to do in the industry.
Yeah, I highly recommend going there as soon as you can and just looking through all of his different projects that he has posted. So 10 out of 10. As always, subscribe to us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the podcast platforms if you want to hear more interviews like this one, and leave us a review on Apple. It tells the algorithm that you enjoyed us. And if you did enjoy us, feel free to share this episode with a friend that you know that might benefit from hearing what Lincoln Adams had to say about being an artist and what it takes to be successful.
Connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, Destination Arete, Arete, for more interviews like this one, as well as information about community activities and upcoming Arete projects. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another interview, so we'll see you then.